Good afternoon and welcome. This is Kathy Lesh from Battelle, and this is the third in our eCQM series of webinars for specialty societies and patient advocacy groups. So we've been doing these for a while, started in December with the eCQM series, and they're a complement to the other series that we have on a pretty much bi-weekly basis. And these webinars are to engage you in communications, in addition to our newsletters, websites, and emails. These eCQM-based webinars are going to be occurring pretty much on a monthly basis. The next one won't be until the end of March, and you'll be getting information about that. And each one of these sessions is designed to provide information and education on some aspect of eCQMs. So, as usual, the first half of each session will involve presenting that information, while the second half is an opportunity to ask questions, provide feedback, and to have a discussion. And what you can do now, if you have questions while the presentation is going on, feel free to use the chat function, and we'll open it up for questions after the presenters are done. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, and that is Kirsten Barrett. Dr. Barrett has been with Mathematica since 2005. Most of her work is focused on measure development and testing, healthcare quality, and disparities in care. In addition to measure development and testing, Dr. Barrett oversees large-scale data collections on topics related to disability. Her work has been published in numerous peer-reviewed journals, and she is a frequent presenter at national conferences. And she will be ably assisted by two of her colleagues, Sam Simon and Cindy Cullen, when we get to the conversation section. And with that, we can pass it on to Kirsten.
Thanks, Kathy. As Kathy said, my name is Kirsten Barrett, and I'm a senior survey researcher at Mathematica. I'm currently working on a number of CMS-funded projects focused on developing new eCQMs for use in quality payment programs. And the measures I work on involve both hospitals as well as eligible professionals. I'd like to say thanks for having me today. I'm excited to talk with you about eCQM testing. And as Kathy said, two of my colleagues are on the phone, Cindy and Sam. They both have a wealth of experience with measure testing and will hopefully be able to participate in the discussion after the presentation. So today's presentation is intended to be an overview of the eCQM testing process from start to finish. We'll first quickly go over the objectives of the session and then dive in with a description of what testing is, what are the phases, who participates, what activities occur, and common challenges. My intent is to leave sufficient time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. At the end of this session, my hope is that you'll understand the eCQM testing process, what it is, who participates, what is the nature and timing of testing activities, and what challenges typically arise. So what is eCQM testing? Testing is an iterative process of evaluating the eCQM's readiness for implementation. It's guided by the blueprint for the CMS Measure Management System, what we commonly refer to as the blueprint. Testing is focused on the National Quality Forum's criteria for measure endorsement. These are importance, feasibility, scientific acceptability, and usability. And we'll be talking about each of these during the session today. So this is a schematic from the blueprint that depicts where testing falls within the measure development cycle. As you can see, it occurs after the measure specifications have been drafted, but before any implementation decisions are made. It's important to note that the measure specifications may be refined during the testing process. Thus, the measure specifications are considered to be in draft form at the inception of testing. And the circle highlights the topics that we'll be discussing today. eCQM testing occurs in two phases, alpha and beta. This two-phased approach allows CMS to make decisions about continuing, ceasing, or modifying measure development and testing activities at key points throughout the process. For each measure in development, we have a testing plan memo that provides CMS with a roadmap of the testing activities that will occur in each phase. Alpha testing is considered the formative phase of testing. During this phase, feedback is sought from key stakeholders about the measure specifications, particularly the measure logic, and ensuring that we are accurately capturing what we are trying to capture. Stakeholders include providers impacted by the measure, whether outpatient or hospital-based, patients and caregivers, IT staff, specialty societies, and vendors. Also, during this period of time, we seek to determine if the data elements required for the measure calculation are readily available within various EHR systems. And we'll talk more about feasibility assessments a bit later in the presentation. After alpha testing is complete, we move on to beta testing. This is sometimes referred to as field testing. The primary focus of beta testing is on the scientific acceptability of the measure, or the extent to which the measure scores are reliable and valid. It is during beta testing that we contract with test sites to participate in data extraction and manual data abstraction. And we'll talk about both of these in more detail as we move along. During alpha and beta testing, we continually update CMS on the progress of testing, and there are often points throughout the testing process where CMS decides to either proceed or to cease testing activities. For example, last year we had a measure focused on lung protective ventilation for patients with acute respiratory distress syndrome. CMS opted to cease testing because they felt that the low denominator count did not justify the burden that hospitals would likely incur if required to report. There are a number of different people and entities that participate in testing. These include test sites, which, depending on the measure, may be an outpatient site, an emergency department, a hospital, or some combination of these. We also involve provider and caregivers in interviews and focus groups. The larger public is made aware of the measure through a 30-day public comment period. And we also try to engage vendors, as well as any technical expert panels or advisory boards that are appropriate. And depending on the measure, we may also engage other federal agencies. For example, with an opioid measure we currently have in development, we've engaged the CDC, ASPE, and SAMHSA for their technical expertise and help identifying leads for test sites. We also actively seek input from specialty societies on the measure's importance and relevance and the extent to which it is consistent with best practice or existing clinical guidelines. Also, specialty societies offer valuable input about how providers may respond to the measure. And these testing activities a bit already when I was describing alpha and beta testing. Now we'll take a closer look at the different testing activities and how they inform the NQF criteria of importance, feasibility, usability, reliability, and validity. It illustrates the different data sources we use during testing and how each inform one or more of the NQF criteria. As you can see, some data sources inform multiple criteria like interviews, and other activities like feasibility scorecards and data extraction and abstraction focus on only one criterion. Next, I'll briefly describe each of the criteria and how the testing activities play out for each. We'll first talk about importance. Importance is the extent to which the measure is important in making gains in healthcare quality and improving health outcomes for an aspect of care with overall poor performance. We gather qualitative information from providers, patients, and experts about the measure's importance and the likelihood that implementation of the measure would result in higher quality of care for the population impacted. Typically, we do interviews, focus groups, and meetings with experts to gather this information. Usually by the time testing begins, measures have been deemed important based on the environmental scan and information contained within the business case, both completed prior to the inception of testing. The next NQF criteria is feasibility. Are the data elements required for the measure calculation available in the appropriate format in the EHR? Assessing feasibility is critical, and it's often a key factor in CMS's decision about moving forward with a measure or ceasing development and testing. We look at feasibility on 4 dimensions. Are data available? Are data accurate? Are data coded to a standard terminology? And are data collected as part of the standard workflow? The feasibility assessment is guided by a feasibility scorecard. The scorecard contains each data element required for the measure calculation. For each, we rate the current and future feasibility on each of the dimensions I just mentioned. Future is considered 3 to 5 years out. Scores range from a 1 to a 3, with 3 being the highest score. The means of administering the scorecard varies. In some cases, the site completes the scorecard, and we conduct a follow-up interview to clarify any scores that are unclear. In other cases, scorecards are completed during on-site workflow assessments. The most important thing is that the person completing the scorecard be knowledgeable about the site's clinical workflow and documentation practices. The scorecard can give you a sense of how feasible a measure is. For example, a measure scoring 3 on data availability for each data element may be more feasible to implement than a measure scoring lower on data availability. However, caution should be used in interpreting the scorecard, particularly when the measure logic contains or statements. Scientific acceptability is the extent to which the measure yields reliable and valid results. With reliability, we evaluate variation in provider-level scores. The key testing activity here is data extraction. Data extraction involves the test site providing an electronic file containing the patient-level EHR data necessary for the measure calculation. These data are used to examine reliability. We analyze the data to determine how likely it is that the difference in scores between providers or practices are true differences. Data extraction can be labor-intensive for test sites. We start with a training call where we walk sites through the measure logic, and we review the data file layout, the data dictionary, value sets, and other data extraction materials. We typically try to engage sites in a weekly meeting to review test extracts, and once the test extract, layout, and content is deemed acceptable, the site creates a full extract for the entire measurement period. Data extraction can occur quickly, requiring as little as 1 to 2 weeks. However, most test sites, in our experience, take anywhere from 1 to 3 months to produce a final data extract. The next step is to examine validity. For data element validity, we seek to determine if the electronically extracted and manually abstracted data match. For measure score validity, we attempt to determine if the measure score aligns with other established benchmarks of quality. To test validity, we start by randomly selecting a subset of patients from the electronically extracted data. We then send data abstractors to test sites to manually abstract EHR data. This helps inform data element and measure validity. We look at the level of agreement between the electronic data and the manually abstracted data, and the agreement in the measure calculations between the two. There are a number of challenges when we get to the point of data extraction and abstraction. Contracting requirements are often the most time-consuming aspect. Another challenge is that test sites sometimes think they have the data necessary, but when they actually look into their EHR and workflows, they don't have what we need. We try to identify this proactively by sending test sites a screening tool that contains a simplified list of data elements required for the measure calculation. We ask the site to complete the form with the help of their IT staff. Oftentimes, the clinical staff think data are available based on their documentation practices, but IT informs us that the format of the data is not correct or the data element is not extractable. Usability is the extent to which end users find the measure results useful for decision-making. This includes primarily providers and patients. We typically seek qualitative input on usability via focus groups, interviews, and public comment. We ask if knowing the measure score would impact a patient's decision about where to access care, or if the measure score would be used to infer a provider's quality of care. For providers, we ask if the measure calculation accurately reflects care. Does a higher score mean higher quality, or could a high score be due to something other than the care rendered? What do we do once we have collected all this information? We submit test reports. In some cases, we submit an alpha test report, and CMS determines if the findings support additional testing. Then we complete a beta test report. The content required in these reports is pretty well defined in the blueprint. And on this slide, I highlight what is learned through testing. A few of the more significant findings relate to data availability, anticipated burden of implementation, and reliability and validity results. I've spoken about some challenges throughout the presentation. To summarize, these include site recruitment and contracting, technical savvy, formats in which data are received, and mapping to standard codes and terminologies. It's important to think about these challenges at the outset of testing. A few examples. With recruitment, we try to cast a wide net. We work through existing contacts, specialty societies, expert work group members, and federal agencies to identify potential test sites. We start as early as possible in testing, and we try to be exceedingly flexible with recruitment calls and other outreach activities, recognizing that although testing is our priority, it is not the site's priority. Incentives can be helpful, but they often are not the deciding factor, as the amount typically does not cover the effort required to extract data. It's important to sell testing to the site by telling them how they will benefit by participating. In terms of technical capacity, I talked previously about providing the site with data dictionaries, file layouts, and other data extraction materials. This will help minimize the likelihood of receiving data extracts of differing formats, and it will make the site's efforts most efficient. Also, it allows test sites to collaborate, especially those with the same EHR system. Just recently, we had test sites sharing programming code for the data extraction. So in conclusion, testing is done to determine the extent to which the eCQM is important, feasible, scientifically acceptable, and usable. It involves many different activities, including interviews, focus groups, feasibility assessments, and data extraction and abstraction. It involves staff at test sites, patients and caregivers, specialty societies, and subject matter experts. And throughout the testing process, CMS reviews progress and may make decisions to alter the course of measure development and testing. And finally, there are many challenges inherent in testing. Some can be minimized by proactive planning, and others will arise during testing and require both patience and flexibility. My contact information, if anybody wants to reach out. And I think that's it.
Thank you, Kirsten. That was great. So now we're opening up the lines for questions, and don't be shy. Well, we still have Kristen Borowski on the phone, who is our CMS person, if you have any CMS-specific questions. Okay, I'll ask a question. How does one get to become, to volunteer potentially for being a testing site? How do you find out that you're actually looking for sites for your testing?
We have a number of different avenues to try to recruit. We sometimes put postings in various CMS newsletters and association letters that go out. We utilize listservs of specialty societies. They can be very helpful in getting the word out for us. Cindy or Sam, I'm sure you guys have ideas too on the outreach. We work through a lot of existing contacts.
Yeah, Kirsten, I was going to, sorry. I was just going to say that a lot of the measures that we develop are very specific, perhaps to a particular specialty or a particular practice type. So we do try to network using our expert work. And because these measures have expert work groups, we often will rely on them. But Cindy, I know you want to say something as well.
I was going to say the exact same thing.
So a couple of things. Number one, so for long-term care, as you know, there are at least a dozen more EHRs, and so when you're doing the abstraction-based or content-based eCQM development, if you pick one partner as maybe an anchor or testing, and then you are able to define and develop a measure, then when you actually implement it, is it post-implementation that you then expand it to the rest of the EHRs? Because they all have different databases, different way they are hosted and all of that. I know it's just a fairly generic question with less technical information in it, but because we're a group of clinicians who's looking at doing this, and we do have one or two EHR vendors that have shown interest, but the biggest EHR vendor in the industry have not been as warm towards letting us use them. So once we develop how easy it is to then kind of either disseminate it to more EHRs, that's number one. Number two is we in post-acute have the resident assessment instrument, which I know people are looking to make it standard throughout all the levels, so inpatient rehab, long-term hospitals, SNFs, home health. But right now they all have their own instruments for assessment that has a lot of clinical and other data. So can eCQMs be developed based on those assessment instruments also as the data source? Because that really is the easiest way to submit data. And this is for physicians I'm talking about. I'm not talking about facilities.
Okay, thanks. As far as the vendor issue for EHRs is concerned, the blueprint requires that we have at least 2 different EHRs involved in testing. We usually try to get 3 if we can. We usually have more than one test site, obviously, to get 3 different EHRs. The other piece that we have is a fairly active vendor engagement effort. We try to reach out to the vendors. In some cases, we have key contacts at the different EHR vendors, and we can just call and have a discussion about data element availability, the extent to which their data are coded. And then we also do some survey-type efforts where we send the vendors the list of data elements, and we ask them, if the data are available in their existing EHR, and if it's not, if it's something that they could add, and what the burden would be on hospitals from their perspective if the measure were to be implemented.
Yeah. So definitely the question is, this is not the hospital world, in hospital world, I know things have narrowed quite a bit. We have a select few remaining vendors, and I'm sure there's a lot of work being done. But are you guys aware at all if that survey or a list of folks that are willing to work on this, has anybody gotten the post-acute vendors together so far?
Well, we have done ambulatory care as well, so outpatient settings. We do a number of different projects in that realm as well. And we typically, with our survey effort, we typically try to reach about 10 different vendors.
But directly to your question on post-acute, we have not focused on post-acute, so have not done that direct outreach. I also want to be clear that the outreach that we're talking about is really more at the alpha stage that we engage with the vendors. For our beta testing, we do go to individual test sites, either provider or hospital, and they would be the ones who would bring their EHR vendor to the table if required. We are hearing similar things from that to what you're hearing, in that not all vendors can or choose to participate with the testing, that a lot of it does fall on the individual test sites to do this work. What we would like to encourage is that it is really more of a three-sided approach here, with the vendor, with the test site, and then with the measure developer.
The only other thing I would add to what Kirsten and Cindy said, and I think that this addresses your question about implementation, or how can a measure that was tested in a handful of sites or a handful of different EHRs be consumed by all different vendors? And the answer to that is standardization and the use of standards. So all of our measures have to be expressed using a set of standards for eCQM expression that are propagated by CMS, or really by HHS, I think more broadly. And so we have to use and rely on, for example, for individual values to indicate a particular condition or a clinical process. We have to use standardized vocabularies to express those. So that's one piece of standardization. And then the other is how the measure is actually expressed. Again, this is a standard that is used by CMS, and it's used for all of its eCQMs.
Sam, do you want to touch on the second part of that question?
Sorry, what was the second part?
About the standardized form. I forget the name of the gentleman who asked the question.
Raj. So we do have the standardized or the resident or patient assessment instrument that has a lot of clinical data, like the minimum data set. For SNFs, we have the IRF-PI and then we have OASIS for home health. So there's a lot of clinical data in there. So are there eCQMs that are being developed out of those also, or is it easier? Or because from providers' ease of use and also burden for provider when they use it, and again, this is for physicians, not for facilities. It's much easier and much more. I think the testing probably is going to be much more easier if we use that. Is there? And again, I think if there's not much work done in post-acute yet, it probably is a similar answer that folks don't know. But as we gear up to not only develop a meaningful set for post-acute physicians, we're also looking at aligning both facility and physician measures. So I know most of the facility measures that are being worked on right now under the Impact Act for post-acute are going to be taken out of that MDS or the assessment instrument. But the physicians one, we have never done that. So the alignment efforts would be much more easier if that was where the physician measures could be developed out of too.
Sure.
So I guess that is more of a comment than a question now.
fair point. But going to your point about assessment instruments, so the measures that we develop are, because they're focused on both the ambulatory setting and inpatient settings, we don't use the long-term care, we don't use the MDS, we don't use the IRF-PI. But having said that, a lot of the measures that we develop for the ambulatory setting do rely on assessment instruments. Patient-reported outcome measures are really, CMS obviously has a great interest in developing outcome measures that look at care from the patient's perspective. And so we've been working to incorporate patient-reported outcome data as a part of, or to be the basis for a clinician-focused measure. So I would think the MDS and other sorts of assessment instruments would work similarly, like they would be really ripe for developing measures for the long-term care or post-acute care settings. But again, I don't think the three of us can speak to that very well. There may be others on the call who can, but we don't do any development for post-acute settings.
And we got a question came in through the Q&A. And the question is, for the feasibility scorecard, do you provide different weights to the categories, or are they weighted the same? Is it unique to each measure being tested?
Yeah, I think we weight them the same. I think in reality, the data availability domain probably gets the most attention because if the data are not available in the EHR to calculate the measure, then it's going to be very difficult to implement the measure. So there's no instructional component to give added weight to any one category, but I think that a large focus is on that data availability domain across measures.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? I'll take that as a no. Okay, just wanted to remind you, this is on all our slides, if you're currently developing measures that you'd like to present to CMS, please contact the support desk. We're always looking for new spotlight presenters. So the next regular webinar is next Wednesday, and it's on measure development and measure specification. And then the next eCQM-focused webinar will be on March 29th, and it will address codes, code systems, and value sets. And if you have any suggestions for future topics for either the eCQM or the regular webinars, please email us at mmssupport@battelle.org. So again, here's some contact information. Kristen was on the call earlier, but she had to jump off. And Dr. Ted Long is also participating in this work outreach with us. All right. If we don't have any more questions, or if you do have questions that you think of down the road, you can always email us the question at mmssupport@battelle.org. So if there are no more questions, I want to thank our presenters today. That was great, and we look forward to seeing you all again later, and I'll give you 20 minutes back. Thank you very much for your participation.